Five Nights at Freddy's is not that scary. At this point, the gameplay loop is very well known, and the jump scares are so frequent that they sorta lost their impact. As a matter of fact, I think I can blame this franchise alone for a good 25% of my desensitization to jump scares in general. The themes changed from point-and-click resource management survival horror to pseudo-open world. And besides that, the lore is so convoluted I feel like I need a team of 20 FBI investigators just to put together a timeline of events. And yet, I love this franchise. And you do too. Here's why. Judging by my YouTube statistics, you are probably a grown-ass man by now, and you have your own grown-ass responsibilities.
I have to go to work.
Both you and your interests may have changed over the years. Maybe when you were younger you were really into FNAF, but now something a bit more adult like Ad Infinitum or the new Amnesia is more your thing. Even so, if you click this video, I'm willing to bet there's a decent chance FNAF still holds a place in your heart. To me, and I'd argue that to a lot of people watching this video, FNAF brings you this nice and, cozy sense of nostalgia. And additionally, there's a good chance that your enjoyment of FNAF in your younger years is probably directly responsible for your enjoyment of horror today. In case you couldn't tell, I am a Zoomer, and a good chunk of us grew up on FNAF. Maybe we had experiences with horror before, stuff like Slenderman and Amnesia populated the early YouTube scene. And the truth is that kids are really easy to scare. You can literally just walk up to a 9-year-old and invent some random shit and they will believe it. It's really funny. I remember when I was little, I literally just saw an image of a skeleton and I had a fucking nightmare later that night. It didn't really take a lot, and that's true for a lot of people. Even though nowadays I eat gore and cosmic horror for breakfast, back then when FNAF first blew up, I say we because I'm assuming you're like an 18 to 24-year-old FNAF fan, but if you're younger than that, may I introduce you to a few games? We were just as susceptible to being scared by almost anything. It was that age when kids began to discover just how fascinating the horror genre is, but didn't have quite enough courage to brave through a game or a movie alone. And then came FNAF. Fucking hell. The success of Five Nights at Freddy's can be attributed to many things, but everything can be summarized by the simple fact that when it came out almost a decade ago, the game slapped ass. The first thing is that the game was very innovative. The premise of being a security guard of a pizzeria with animatronics is extremely intriguing, and the gameplay of having to stay in one little room and use the cameras to check if anything is out of the ordinary is just brilliant. Well, not anymore, but back then horror games usually had you walking around a scary location, and if you found a monster, you ran. FNAF took away your mobility and forced you to sit in that little room while the monsters came to you. That gameplay loop inspired games that inspired games. And you know that the moment you saw one of the animatronics somewhere they weren't supposed to be, shit was about to go down. In the first few nights, you didn't exactly know how the animatronics work, or that every camera except for Foxy and 4B are completely useless. You felt panicked because you thought you had to keep track of everyone at all times, and that feeling worked really well. Not only that, but there was also the times when every now and then you get a random event that would scare the shit out of you. You're minding your own business and then you'd go check on the stage camera and see all the animatronics looking directly at you. Or when you look at the corridor and think something is up, only to realize that the posters had been replaced by crying children. Fucking hell, this game found ways to mess with you and they worked really well. But so far, I've only talked about how this game stood out from the other horror titles. Sure, it made it popular, but I think that the real reason why it blew up in the first place is because, as I said in the beginning, FNAF is not that scary. Sure, there are jump scares and a scary atmosphere, but it's comparatively light in terms of horror intensity. There are like 4 images in the game that could be considered gore, and the jump scares are all gifs of goofy little guys either opening their mouths, jumping at you, or taking one step forward in case of Spinky. All the actual heavier content was delivered either through written, spoken, or 8-bit form from the lore newspapers, Phone Guy, and the Death minigames respectively. But the raw game with no additional lore or theories is, comparatively speaking, quite digestible to those who are new to horror, precisely because it is relatively light with the horror elements. Not only that, but there's also a really captivating atmosphere to it and a very intriguing mystery behind it. It was able to draw people in really well, serving as a sort of gateway to the horror genre. To me and to many others, it was our first direct, proper contact with a horror game. The first thing that managed to hook us in. Something that was just intense enough to give you the thrill, but not enough that it overwhelms. You get into FNAF, check out some of the other games in the franchise, see how the lore goes, and you get invested and interested in consuming similar media. Not necessarily mascot horror, because that's a can of worms on its own, but more things that give you an equivalent feeling. After seeing that you were capable of braving FNAF, you probably felt compelled to give a try to other things that you thought were too much for you previously. As a result, we had a bunch of new people getting into horror who would otherwise miss out on the genre entirely for a few years still. But instead, they continue accompanying the new FNAF games, trying to piece together the lore and being introduced and accustomed to different elements of horror media. Fast forward a few years, and those same kids and teenagers who were watching Markiplier all those years ago are now the same people behind the exceptionally well-made fan games and VHSs. And let me take a moment to talk about the VHSs. Anyone who watched some FNAF-inspired analog horror can tell you that it is much scarier than whatever the fuck is going on in the Pizzaplex. These are passion projects by people who either grew up on FNAF or found the lore and premise to be really enthralling. They took time off their lives to learn like Blender and other video making skills to make spectacular homages to this universe. And there are others still who are off on their own doing their own passion projects who probably would have never gotten into horror and developed such a fervent passion for it if it wasn't for Five Nights at Freddy's. As of the writing of the script, the movie hasn't come out, and honestly, from the trailers, I don't think my hopes are up all that much. Even if the plot is good, I doubt it will be able to scare anyone above the age of 15. Stuff like this saw trap looking ass contraction is too cartoonish to actually be scary. In what world would the design of an animatronic warrant the need for sharp spinning metal blades inside the head? It absolutely isn't for ventilation, that's for sure. And given that these are the FNAF 1 animatronics, they weren't yet made for giving children the wood chipper experience. Like it or not, both FNAF's themes and the fact that it pioneered the mascot horror subgenre means that the games and the franchise as a whole is mostly catered towards the younger audience. A completely arbitrary rule that I've made for myself is that if you can make a marketable plushie of your antagonist, give it to a child who doesn't know shit about the franchise and they would think it looks cute, there is a good chance that the original design wasn't as intense in the horror department. It has to be sorta light in order not to traumatize the younger audience too much. I'm sure we can all think of ways in which we could make the things we saw in the trailer scarier. For example, instead of giving the animatronics red eyes, make them black like when Bonnie stares at the screen. Or instead of, well, this fucking mess, imagine a clip where it's literally just Mike Schmidt staring at a completely still animatronic for like 10 seconds in complete silence. Can you tell which animatronic is my favorite yet? You don't even have to put a jump scare here. Literally, just the silence is enough to unnerve a lot of people, me included. Though this and other improvements would probably make the movie scarier, like I said, if it wants to sell to the majority of its audience, it has to be relatively chill. I hope to God that this take about the movie not being scary ages horribly. But you know what? I'm okay with the movie not being scary, because unless they fumble the plot in some catastrophic way, I will like it because I like the franchise. When I get into FNAF, I don't really expect to see excessive gore or heavy themes, excluding the child murder, because if you go too far in that direction, it loses those characteristics that made it shine so much in the first place. FNAF's core identity is inherently a little silly. There's the ominous vibe and the hidden lore, but only the first 4 games actually took themselves seriously with the arguable exception of the poster boop noise. After that, Scott started to spec a little bit into humor, and both back then and right now, I still find the silly moments really amusing. Not to mention how memeable the franchise became, especially after Security Breach. I have yet to see another community make me chuckle at the sound of a man being left for dead. Just look at this shit. Even though Security Breach was a buggy mess, and even though it's way different than the classical FNAF games, I still had a lot of fun watching it, because I'm not going to spare 80 GB for this game. It's nice to see that a game that I grew up with is still going strong. If I want to have a fun time, I'll just boot up Help Wanted and fuck around with the game modes. If I actually want to feel scared, I'll just go to the VHSs or some of the more polished games. But ultimately, I'm thankful to this franchise for having introduced me to a genre quite as deep and intriguing as horror. I wouldn't be the person that I am today if it wasn't for this game, and I probably would have missed out on a lot of very interesting stories as well. Five Nights at Freddy's may have garnered a bit of a reputation due to its fanbase, but it still has a lot of aspects and branches that can be enjoyed by pretty much anyone who's into mystery and horror. You get into FNAF, have your first experience with a scary situation in a controlled environment, and you leave having learned how to enjoy horror, and maybe with 5 terabytes of Roxane Wolf pornography.